Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, I was living with my best friend. We spent our formative years together, getting into trouble and barely managing to get out of it. I can safely say that there is no one in this world I know better or cherish as much as them. They also have bipolar disorder type 1, a neurochemical condition that, unlike in the movies, doesn't cause mood swings, but rather a slow cycle of rising and falling mood that plays out over the course of a year. This means that every 6 months or so they burst into a manic state of hyper-awareness, high emotions and reckless confidence, or they fall into a deep depression as debilitating as any physical illness could ever be. Over the course of our lives, both of us have seen this cycle rise and fall time and time again. We tried everything we could to make this process easier or to stop it somehow, but over time, we began to accept that even with the medication that takes away the worst of it, this cycle of mania and depression would always be there, just getting in the way. One day, they told me quietly they could feel the beginnings of a depression cycle starting. We reasoned we probably had a few weeks before they became unable to work or even get out of bed. They also told me that if the next couple of months were going to be hell, they wanted to scratch an item off the bucket list first. I was a little unsure about it at first. I had never taken these things myself, and I was unsure how safe they would be for someone with bipolar. We all hear the stories about psychedelics growing up, that they make you crazy, that they do permanent brain damage, etc., etc.
One girl threw up her own pelvis bone before she snuffed the lid. What a fucking disgrace.
Researching it myself, however, provided no conclusive evidence of this, so I elected to join in. We decided to take magic mushrooms in Minecraft.
For legal reasons, this definitely did not happen in the real world and was a purely digital experience and no one should ever try ever.
So on a free Saturday night, we took a dose
In Roblox.
of approximately 1.75 grams of mushrooms each. The trip
Through the valleys of Skyrim.
was largely uneventful for me. I felt warm, positive, and it felt as though my brain was working very well. My friend reported no such effects, but was still quiet and contemplative for most of the evening. They weren't exactly enjoying it, but it clearly wasn't making them crazy either. The real surprise came the next morning. As we sipped our usual morning tea and made each other laugh with our usual morning fart competitions, they looked at me and said, "It's gone." What do you mean? I mean, the depression. It's gone. I feel fine. Great even. So it's just gone. I can't find it. I even looked under the bed. Ha ha ha. At the time I thought it was just a blip, an aberration. I didn't think it would last, but it did. It lasted for months, in fact. It lasted until the next peak of the cycle, which was a manic episode, not a depressive one. To me, it looked like they had skipped the depression cycle entirely. For me, the effect was shorter. I was working full-time in psychiatric care at the time, and I hadn't noticed how much it had been affecting me, but for the next 2 weeks, I skipped to work every morning with a song in my heart. Nothing seemed to bother me. The feeling was welcome, but quite unexpected. Now, 2 points of data do not prove anything, a fact I was well aware of at the time. Did I think I had found the magical cure for depression? Not really, but there was something there, right? Little did I know that behind the scenes, actual scientists were thinking the very same thing and taking action.
I can't heal you in the truth. I can feel your face. I can transcend you with a guitar. I can vaccinate you against all sadness, ladies and gentlemen. All sadness, ladies and gentlemen.
Research into psychedelic substances began in the late 1950s, but the use of psychedelics goes back thousands of years, especially in the indigenous cultures of North and South America. These cultures' ritualistic practices used naturally occurring substances in cacti, and the ayahuasca plant to induce powerful hallucinations with spiritual benefits. It's a shame that imperialism and colonialism wiped out most of these cultures and banned their practices, so a lot of the knowledge is lost to history. But hey, rule Britannia, right lads? The modern research, however, was put on hold for... Hold on, let me check. Over 50 years? By the Nixon administration, who declared a war on drugs as a way of cracking down on hippies and black people. No, I'm not making that up. They admitted it. This led to the UN Psychedelics Convention of 1971, which made all psychedelics a Schedule I drug, which means they have no medicinal value and are dangerous for human consumption. More recently, however, the relaxing of these stupid laws has led to a sudden surge of scientific geniuses and dumbfuck ape men podcast hosts taking an interest in this abandoned field of research and whether or not the whole field of psychiatry has been doing it wrong for the last 50 years. A lot of studies have been published. So many that the information has even filtered down into normie discourse, and people are beginning to wonder, what's taking so long? Is this a game changer for mental health or not? And if it is, what does that mean? So what I've decided to do is to take a look at as many studies as I can find into two substances which have been tested extensively for therapeutic use. Look at the potential benefits of each, how supported by the evidence they are, and the roadblocks to getting potentially life-saving medical treatment. But before we get there, let's take a quick look at how drugs are created and approved in the first place. The first part of creating the medicine is called discovery. It involves identifying what symptoms or conditions you want to treat, which compounds are the best candidates for testing, and isolating the exact molecules within those candidates which have the desired effect. The active molecule, basically. This used to be a much more time-consuming process than it is now. Information technology has, like pretty much everything else, made this both quicker and easier as we progress. Whereas drug developers in the past had to leaf through tons of hard copies of previous studies to identify potential candidates, nowadays you can just set up a huge computer array to do the job for you, checking thousands of compounds per hour. Once you've isolated the active substance, like psilocybin in mushrooms or the DMT in ayahuasca, and you've identified the condition you want to treat, say the lack of serotonin in depressed people, the real testing can begin. The first stage of testing is called preclinical. You don't want medicine killing people. That much should be pretty obvious. If you created something to keep people safe and instead it went around killing people, that would be really embarrassing and make you all look like malicious idiots. Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? Medicine goes through extreme levels of testing before human trials can even begin. This, sadly, involves animal testing, but in some cases human cell cultures and even complex organs made out of stem cells can be used instead. The most common animals used are mice and rats, not only because they are easy to find and breed, but because, as mammals, their biological systems are quite similar to our own. At this stage, the researchers are looking for efficacy, does it actually work? Toxicology, does it cause any side effects? And safety, does it cause any harm, and can that harm be minimized? Once this is established, the process of formulation can begin, where the researchers try to put the active substance into a form that people can actually take. If it's in pill form, for example, the substance needs to be digestible and soluble in water. The meds won't work if you can't get them into your body well enough. A lot of drugs fall to pieces at this stage, but we don't really have to worry about that with psychedelics. A lot of the research has already been done by millions of willing participants in a grand experiment known as life for the last 50 years. Drugs that kill people generally don't last long on the black market. Unless, of course, they're highly addictive and other options are unavailable looking at you, crocodile. One thing life can't teach you, however, is how the meds affect things in utero. A lesson that medical science has learned the hard way. For that stuff, you have to test it on people. Next we have clinical trials, broken down into several stages. Once we've established that the medicine can actually work and won't kill people, human trials can finally begin. Stage 1 is pilot studies involving less than 100 people. Stage 2 involves improved studies with a more varied sample size. And Stage 3 is mass trials, basically trying to find as many people to test as possible in all possible medical situations. It's worth noting here, due to mental health conditions being different levels of rare in the populations, the sample sizes may seem smaller than we want. That's just because there are less people with the target conditions overall. We just have to go with the samples we can find and deal with it. If you read scientific articles at all, you may have heard of the term randomized control trials, and this is where these come in. Essentially, once the target sample is acquired, they are sorted into two groups, the control group, who get the fake or placebo treatment, and the experimental group, who get the real shit, man. As the name suggests, which participant ends up in which group is entirely random, but that itself is not enough to ensure a fair test, as 9-year-olds might say. If the participant knows which group they are in, they might subconsciously change their answers based on prior opinions of it. If the scientists know what group they're in, they may be able to skew the results towards success, wouldn't you? At this point, these guys have been pinning their hopes on this for years. This is what is meant by a single-blind or double-blind procedure. If one group is blind to who is in what group, that's a single blind. If both, it's a double. A double-blind procedure is the gold standard for these sorts of things. If no one knows exactly who is getting the treatment until the results are in, no one can monkey with the reporting. But that isn't always possible. In the case of psychedelics, for example, the treatment being developed is not just a pill. It's a therapeutic process assisted by pills. In that situation, it's difficult to keep everyone in the dark about what's happening. The therapists administering the treatment, for example, are going to work out eventually what kind of therapy they're doing. That's why the researchers, participants, and the therapists are often kept out of communication with each other during the process. The more ignorance, ironically, the more knowledge can be gained. At time of writing, psychedelic medicine is around stage 2 of clinical trials, depending on which one we're talking about. And the results are, well, we'll get to that later. There is one stage of trials left, and it's truly a beast. A black dragon looming over the horizon, threatening to burn down all that has been created by man. Politics. Ugh, the approval process. It's like a butthole. Everyone has them, and we just have to try and keep them clean. The government of every country has its own organisation to review the evidence for each treatment. In the States, it's the FDA. In the UK, it's the MHRA. They differ in name, but the process is basically similar. It's essentially an orgy of peer review. Multiple experts on various disciplines are brought in from the outside to review the evidence to make sure that the studies were done properly. The head honchos of the organisations have the final say, but as the head honchos are usually politicians, this presents a problem for psychedelics. Unusually, this is less of a problem in the US than in the UK. Multiple states like Colorado and Oregon have already taken steps to decriminalise psychedelics, and the legalisation of marijuana in even more places has inspired a sort of political push towards the freedom position. Over on my side of the pond, however, we are being led by literal idiot crime bosses who, for some reason that entirely escapes me, are floating the idea of taking the passports of drug users. Why? What will that solve? Fuck the Tories. They've always been useless, bigoted, capitalist theologians, but declaring a new drug war in the middle of a pandemic is fucking psychotic. The nerve of these up-jumped, useless cuck. Anyway, the point is, politics can really get in the way of progress in this field. During the Blair government, one of their own hand-picked scientific advisors wrote an open letter recommending the legalisation and decriminalisation of marijuana and ecstasy. Yeah, he was immediately fired and his work dismissed. No reason given. Things have changed since then, no doubt, but the long arm of the law doesn't like being shortened for anything. I'm not Mystic Meg. I can't be sure what the future holds, but I can be sure that in order to persuade the malicious, selfish, sheltered sociopaths that we allow to run our society for some reason, the evidence has to be ironclad. So how good is this evidence? What can we expect to see from this new wave of treatments, if they come to pass? MDMA, ecstasy, Mandy, Molly, she goes by many names, but one she usually doesn't get is psychedelic. Hear me out. Psychedelics are usually described as activating specific serotonin receptors. These ones, to be extra specific. MDMA is not that specific, but it is a serotonergic drug. It hits the same receptors eventually. Plus, the therapeutic uses are being investigated in the same way, so eat me.
Fuck you, it's January!
The commonly known effects of MDMA are summed up in one of its names and are implied by the rest. Ecstasy, signifying the euphoria, Mandy and Molly, female names, signifying the love and empathy that comes with it. The cause of those feelings can only be described as a forced dump of all the serotonin in your brain at once. Serotonin, as you probably know, is the happy juice. Yay, the happy juice! Okay, fine, it plays a critical role in your ability to feel joy and to form positive memories and associations. Is that scientific enough for you, Dad? It also releases adrenaline and dopamine, but serotonin is the main player here. The euphoria from a massive release of serotonin is difficult to describe through someone who hasn't felt it before, but when I took it for the first time, in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, it felt like I already knew what it could do. The warm tingle up your spine, the pure joy and contentment, the feeling of my nerves lighting up like a Christmas tree. The feeling of the first time in Halo 3 would never and has never left me. It's a memory so positive, so blissful. It acts as a perfect mirror of trauma, almost an anti-PTSD. I wonder if that means something. Oh wait! Therapeutically, MDMA's primary function, at least during the current batch of experiments, is to treat sufferers of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD historically, and even today, has proven itself a very stubborn bastard to treat. It walks a line between neurosis and psychosis. The causes may be external, like a neurotic disorder, but the results often include hallucinations and your perceptions of reality breaking down periodically, like psychosis. PTSD has more causes than cancer, but as the name implies, it's essentially born of trauma. Usually, PTSD is most associated with the traumas of war and violence, but as I've discussed before, trauma has many forms, and all of them can cause PTSD if you have enough of it. The problem with traditional trauma counselling is that it's essentially a minefield, carefully unpacking the triggers, the thinking patterns, the emotions surging with every sentence. It's akin to taking apart a pocket watch with your fingers, in order, without damaging or losing a single tiny spring. Drop one little piece, the whole thing explodes in your hands. A lot of people who need it don't complete or even attempt trauma counselling. The process of going over it, of feeling those things again, of being forced to remember things that you're trying to forget, is just too terrifying for people to face, understandably. But what if, however, there was a way to shield yourself from that pain, to talk about your trauma openly, honestly, and completely, without the fear of those emotions coming back, without going into shock or triggering a panic attack? That is the function of MDMA therapy. The drug physically prevents you from feeling the pain, and the therapy encourages you to talk about the pain from an emotionally safe distance, working to change your perspectives and unpick how it affected you without the fear, encouraging you not to just process it, but come away from it feeling positively, having disconnected the bad memories from the fight or flight response. The evidence for this approach is frankly fucking staggering. Participants in the MDMA therapy studies report reduction in nightmares, improved relationships, improved mood, better social engagements, increased self-awareness, and increased ability to feel emotions normally, and in some cases even a moderate reduction in alcohol use. 97.6% of participants in one meta-analysis reported benefits. 92% said that those benefits lasted when they followed up on months later, and 50%, a majority, said that the benefits didn't just last over time, they actually grew. The therapy, at least for these participants, provided a kind of springboard for self-improvement, implying it was a life-changing process, something that made people better. CAT scores, the measurement used to measure PTSD severity, declined across the board in literally all of the studies I can currently find. The other benefits are spread across different studies studying different outcomes, but each of them was very statistically significant, at least among the modest sample sizes of these studies. You can see why these findings made psychology nerds, especially mental health workhorses like me, rave the fuck out, right? To have such amazing success in fighting an infamously stubborn, lifelong condition, something we spend a lot of time and effort trying to help people just survive, let alone treat.
Oh hell yes, brother, this shit is my jam!
One of the best things about it, and the thing that most surprised me, was the speed with which it worked, and the minimal effort and cost. Usually, a course of about 6 to 12 sessions is required to meaningfully tackle PTSD. With MDMA assistance, that is cut back to just 2 to 3 sessions. For a publicly funded health service, that is a huge point in its favour. It essentially doubles what we can do with people. Is it without risks or side effects? Not completely. A number of studies found small but significant incidences of, well, the typical side effects of a night out on the Mandy. Nausea, tightness of the jaw, lack of appetite, dizziness, and slightly lowered mood of about a few weeks afterwards. Basically, a mild come down after a night on the Mandy. The kind where you have 5-HTP and painkillers to ease the headache, but you definitely took way too much, right? Because by 5 a.m. you were talking to people who left the room 2 hours ago, and you went through 5 packs of gum and... in Call of Duty? Basically, The consensus so far is a lowish dose of MDMA used in this therapy are pretty safe long term, even if there are a few short-term side effects. And when compared to the side effects of other meds used for PTSD, I think we can say it's a net good, yeah? MDMA-assisted therapy works. So far as we can tell, it works very well for PTSD, and looking at the treatment profile, it might even be able to help with other trauma-related things. This could be just the beginning, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The evidence we have is good enough reason to be hopeful. In time, we may be able to say to war veterans, abuse victims, trauma survivors of all stripes, don't worry, we got you. And we can mean it. Of the classic psychedelics, psilocybin is considered the least intense, and unlike a lot of them, besides DMT, it occurs naturally in the world and wasn't created by a dude in a lab in the 50s. Usually, psilocybin occurs in a bunch of different species of mushrooms, and no, I'm not going to tell you which ones, only that they all taste awful and chewing them is not recommended. In Rock Band. The important part is psilocybin, and the chemical it forms when you digest it, psilocin. If you accidentally trip and fall mouth first into a pile of psilocybin mushrooms, well, statistically you would probably eat a lot of cow shit and need a stomach pump, but besides that, the psilocybin would result in the activation of specific serotonin receptors in parts of the brain, causing hallucinations, low-grade euphoria, enhanced sensations, dilated pupils, dilated time perception, and a sudden realization that you and everyone in the world are just tiny insects living and breeding in the moss that grows on the side of a damp rock hurtling through an infinity of nothing. If, like me, you're dumb enough to look upwards. In Doom. The dosage of psilocybin mushrooms, commonly taken in the community at least, can be categorized as follows. Microdosing. These are tiny daily doses of less than a gram. They won't cause any of the fun stuff I just mentioned, but they apparently confer benefits anyway, if you listen to coders in Silicon Valley. Low doses. Anything between a gram and 2 grams, and generally causes moderate emotional effects, but only mild visual effects. You feel different for sure, but it's not going to be a trip, really. Moderate doses, anything between 2 and 4 grams, now you're taking a trip. But it's going to be pretty grounded, and reality stays present, even if it bends a lot, and it's difficult to perceive behind all those colours. High doses. This is anything over 4 grams or 5 grams, if you really want what Terence McKenna called the hero's journey. This is where your grip on reality, and most interestingly, your sense of self, get pretty loose. This is where you meet the ego death, the dissolution of who you think you are. Ego death is a difficult concept to describe scientifically because it's entirely subjective, just like your concept of self is in the first place. The best I can describe it, viewing your internal self as an external observer whilst remaining inside yourself but being connected to something much bigger that is difficult to perceive. At least that's the closest I've ever been, in Age of Empires 2, Definitive Edition. Are any of you really vivid dreamers? The experience of ego death can be compared to that in a way. You still feel, you still perceive, and you still think, but all those processes no longer apply to you, or rather, what you think of you. You no longer have any attachment to your self-conception. You cease being a person and become, for lack of a better term, an experience. This is all just poetry, though. It's often hard to pass the line exactly where scientific truth begins and spiritual shit starts clouding up your thinking. You can't test objectively what exists in a purely subjective experience. Otherwise, we would be proving God right now. Psilocybin, after all, is just a chemical, and the current focus of the science is how it treats clinical depression. Depression is one of the most abused words in the English language, so let's clear up some bullshit quickly while we're here. 1. It's often called a mental health condition. It's not. It's a symptom of a condition. It's more like the sneeze and the cold that causes it. Lots of things can make you sneeze. Internal, external, whatever. And depression works the same way. 2. Depression is not just sadness. Sadness, or negative affect, is an emotional response to something that happens. Depression, true depression, is a feeling of numbness, apathy, being unable to feel motivation or emotions at all. Clinically depressed people don't identify themselves as sad, they identify themselves as feeling dead inside. They don't usually say too much about it because even thinking a single word can feel like it takes 2 weeks. Depression isn't tears. It's blank stares and nothingness. 3. Exercise is a preventative, not a cure. if you tell a depressed person to just get out of bed and exercise, bro, you're an idiot and you're not helping. Put the bro science back in the box and take your friend to someone who knows what they're talking about, for their sake. Okay, rant ended. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, etc, etc. Look, depression sucks, okay? It's your brain declaring war on everything positive in your life. Obviously, it must be destroyed. But how?
What do? I mean, do we go after him with one of your, things that you say, like a big bum dildo of vengeance or something?
There you go, that's my girl, yeah.
Regular antidepressants, both tricyclic and SSRIs, have a pretty bad rap in modern discourse. But they do in fact work. They stop the depression. They drag people a few steps back from the edge, but they don't magically turn the cliff into a beach overnight. They are a flawed treatment in many ways. They take at least 2 weeks to see any effects most of the time. A lot of the side effects, especially sexual dysfunction, suck in a major way. You can be on the things for years at a time, and coming off them can be scary and feel very, very weird. Surely our advanced modern world with our bullet trains, large hadron colliders and internet memes can do better, right? Looking at the research, yeah, we probably can. Psilocybin combined with therapy has been found to halve depression scores in patients with MDD, or major depressive disorder. While depression, the symptom, is pretty common, MDD is a diagnosis that's only given when the shit is chronic and severe. Not only did it cut the scores in half, the effect was pretty much immediate. At the first weekly follow-up, the depression score had dropped to its lowest point and stayed there until about 3 months later, when it crept up a little bit and stayed there again. Basically, it plateaued out. Nowhere close to the baseline taken before the intervention, even with the deviations taken into account. A small 2020 meta-analysis concurs with this result, but it does point out a flaw in the current research I'll get back to in a moment. The depression-reducing effects have also found to be highly effective in late-stage cancer patients confronting death. Existential dread is powerful enough to spin out people who are perfectly healthy. The life-threateningly ill, literally facing the fear of death itself, found the benefits to be, quote, rapid and sustained. Not just on depression, but on its just as shitty cousin, anxiety. Oh yeah, did I mention it lowers anxiety too? Because it sure seems like it. We can go a bit further than this. There's neurological research into the benefits of shrooms that suggests the psilocybin can eliminate fear response to certain stimuli and literally create new pathways in the brain. It actually triggers the creation of new synapses, allowing people to think differently easily. As a science nerd, it's difficult not to get overexcited and wildly speculate hearing stuff like that, or from hearing anecdotes from respected scientists about the neuroregenerative properties of mushrooms. But this stuff is still in pilot studies right now, so I can't give it more than a maybe, we'll see. The depression-fixing elements are much more concrete. But that doesn't mean there isn't pushback. For example, here's a study that claims and seems on the surface to demonstrate that psilocybin treatment doesn't treat depression any better than SSRIs. That's not good news for us, is it? Maybe I'm wasting my time making this video after all. Ha! No. Today I'm a scientist, and refuting only makes me dig deeper. If you look at the dosage closely, the dosage of psilocybin is pretty small, really. At least compared to the ones that I've done recreationally in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, a classic of the first-person RPG genre. And let me tell you, 25 milligrams is about a gram and a bit of dried mushrooms when you look into it. That's not even enough to make colours brighter, really. The dose of SSRI, on the other hand, was the maximum dose allowed. 20 milligrams of citalopram is a lot, and anecdotally, it can make your headspace a little spiky and impulsive. Sertraline is generally the first one doctors go with for that reason. Also, while the abstract of the paper declares the differences to be non-significant after 6 weeks, looking at the data in depth shows that it's still pretty close to it. And while 4 patients stopped taking their daily dose of SSRIs due to the side effects, no one turned down the second dose of the mushroom medicine. Oh, also, the SSRI group had to take a dose every single day, which if you live in a country without free prescriptions is going to cost a lot over the course of a year. With psilocybin, you only need 2 doses to get the same effect for the same time. Even when it doesn't work, it's still better. How about that? But what about the flaw in the meta-analysis I mentioned earlier? What was the issue there, huh? What problem could break your line of thinking so much you felt the need to include it in your science video? The problem is, there's just not enough comparable studies yet to do a large-scale meta-analysis and force the governments of the world to give this stuff to depressed people on request. The studies we have all use different structures looking for different effects and testing them in different ways. But if the only flaw in the current research is more please, I think we have something on our hands here. Depression, no matter the cause, is a shit. I've brushed with it myself before, and not only does it rob you of your ability to just do things or feel emotions, it feels like it lasts forever. If I had known, back during my darkest moments, that there was a solution that was fast, effective, and I only had to do it once without waiting 2 weeks for the sertraline to kick in, I'd bite my way through concrete trying to get at it. Well, we're closer now than we have ever been to making that utopia a reality. I have a feeling when it finally gets the green light, depression will eventually go the way of polio and just fuck off forever. The world itself will never be the same. And that's a good thing, right? Right?
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
Want to elect somebody else who's willing to legalize marijuana and expose our children to that gateway drug?
Well, the main point is that taking drugs is itself wrong, and that is why they are illegal.
He said he'd love me forever if I smoked crack with him. He lied.
Dropped acid when I was 18. I was over at these people's house one night. I was pretty jacked up on marijuana, so I decided to try it.
They said half a hit of E would be fun. They lied.
Go to Colorado and see if you want to live there. See if you want to live in a major city in Colorado where there's, head shops popping up on every corner and people flying into your airport just to come and get high.
Okay then, let's do this. Conservatism isn't just a political party or even an ideology, really. It's a reaction, hence the term reactionary that lefties like me are so fond of. I would go a step further in describing conservatism as a primarily emotional reaction that often gets justified afterwards by a process of rationalization. I bring this up because even the most breadiest and bread-pilled people can still express conservatism and reactionary thinking sometimes. The reaction to medicalization, decriminalization or legalization of drugs is often, but it'll be anarchy, lawlessness, 4 a.m. street parties every night, drugged up teenagers doing the crime, making out with each other, underground BDSM drug orgies, nothing will be sacred anymore. People bring this up to me whenever I advocate openly for decriminalization of psychedelics, to which my usual response is, yes, and... But to stop memeing and to take those emotional concerns more seriously for a moment, I really should answer their question with a question. What do you think is happening right now? Even under intense criminalization, MDMA, mushrooms, or pretty much any drug really, are easy to find if you want them, in Pokemon Stadium 2. They have been for decades, even back when the internet was a sci-fi concept and computers still needed punch cards. Anyone who had even a slightly wild teenage phase is aware of this. Even if you didn't do drugs yourself, you knew people who did. Nowadays, you don't even have to ask your buddies for a hookup. You just have to stumble into the right social media forum and see motherfuckers advertising it like it's the hot new toy this Christmas. The thing you're so afraid of is already happening, people. All we can do is educate people honestly and allow them to make up their own minds. If you really care about people's safety, this approach of criminalization has clearly failed you. Just like attempts to control people always do. While most of this video has been primarily an argument for the medicalization of MDMA and mushrooms, I think there is evidence there for decriminalization as well, if people can put their emotional attachment to Puritanism aside long enough to look at it. So with that fear response addressed, let's put to bed any practical concerns people might have about drug use not resulting in long prison sentences, and this damaging society somehow. How can we do this? By looking at how decriminalization has actually gone for places that have tried it. The most famous example is of course Portugal. In 2001, Portugal initiated a new drug policy with the express goal of reducing HIV infections among drug users, which was skyrocketing at the time. What they did was make possession legal for everything. The core idea was that drug addiction should not be treated as a criminal matter. It should be a medical one. Dealing and selling was still illegal, but owning and taking was not. They also instituted largely non-mandatory therapy provisions, funded needle exchanges, and did large-scale public awareness campaigns encouraging people to seek help now that the addicts were safe from arrest. As the architect of the policy outright stated, it was the total package. After a few years, the number of new HIV cases from drug use had fallen dramatically, and kept falling to the point where now, rather than hundreds of new cases, the number is barely in double digits. Drug-related deaths also fell off a cliff, to the point where they now have the lowest rate of drug deaths in the EU. The use of illegal drugs fell. It was always below the European average, but now it was even lower, especially amongst young people aged 15 to 34. It's hard to say why, for certain of course, but the policy of thorough education rather than just drugs are bad, okay, probably changed the public view of drug abusers to that of knowing sympathy rather than ignorance and curiosity and fear. Sex education has been shown to work in a similar way. It's a lot harder to talk your kids into doing something if they already know what's happening. Oh, and for the deficit hawks out there, the social costs, the amount of money lost dealing with drug users, dropped by 18%. So if you're about to ask, how are you going to pay for it then, psych-socialism? How are you going to pay for it, buddy? Get wrecked. Portugal has managed to achieve in 20 years what the war on drugs failed to do in 50. It actually convinced less people to take drugs. Turns out that people are less likely to do something when you tell them the truth about it and what happens, rather than dispersing propaganda that can be easily debunked by, taking it. But that's just one example in one place. One point of data is not a pattern, right? Well, let's look at Oregon.
Arise, arise. I see the future in your eyes.
Yes, Oregon. The Antifa state, the place that's always on fire. The BLM stronghold. Some other things that Sargon of Akkad probably said. In 2020, Oregon, specifically the people of Oregon, voted for drugs to be effectively decriminalized by dropping the severity of the charges and dropping the maximum fine from $6,000 to about $100. After just 1 year, 9,000 people were not arrested, 9,000 people kept their jobs, 9,000 people kept their homes, 9,000 people didn't have their lives ruined for, what, having fun? More interestingly, looking at the demographics of the people who were not arrested, they were disproportionately not white people. It's almost as if these colourblind laws were written deliberately to suppress certain segments of the population by keeping them in a cycle of poverty and debt, by breaking up families, and to keep a permanent impoverished underclass in every city in order to exploit them as cheap labour for the benefit of the owning class. Maybe. While this is a very new development, and we don't have all the conclusive data on the outcomes, there is a lot to be hopeful for. Over 70 mental health organisations across Oregon, some of which were on the verge of closing, have now gotten hugely important grants from the state in order to increase the help available for drug addicts. This was largely funded by the weed taxes from legalising marijuana and the savings from the police not having to arrest people for no reason. It's almost as if we could defund these police and put the money elsewhere to make society so much better that we don't need them anymore. Someone should come up with a snappy slogan for that, maybe put it on a t-shirt or something. The intention of this lovely little aside isn't just to rub it in that libertarian thinking was correct and authoritarian thinking was wrong. Well, maybe a little bit. The point is to reassure people out there that just because something can be used to get high and have fun doesn't mean it needs to be a crime, and doesn't mean we need to be afraid of it. Anything, when misused, can be dangerous, but drugs can also be used as a tool to do good, rather than another thing used to frighten us and keep us from moving forward. From treating diseases, helping those to fall prey to addiction, and overall making the world a better place. Which, as always, is all that really matters. If you watch a lot of psychedelic advocates talk, you get the impression that a utopia, where magic hallucinogens are given out for free and the world has no more problems ever, is just around the corner. A world where we finally find the answers to the human mind, the human experience, and the link between humans and gods can finally be made. I don't believe that. As long as there is suffering in the world, the negative consequences of that suffering will still exist, and so will mental illness. The chemistry of the brain is complex, delicate, and poorly understood. That's why I put a disclaimer at the start of this video. I do not condone taking psychoactive drugs willy-nilly. I do not condone taking them if you have a history of psychosis, especially schizophrenia and all its wacky relatives. Not even in Psychonauts 2. What was the point of this video then? Why go to the effort of pumping this up, just to let us down easy at the end? Because the world doesn't need to be perfect to be better, and when opportunity knocks, we need to answer the door. MDMA and psilocybin spent years, decades being ignored, spat on by the media, politicians, and health professionals. The bias against them will last for years more. The political and social conservatives around the world will be trying their damnedest to make sure of that. Why? Because they don't care about what works if it only works for people like us. They care about their donors because their donors give them money that prevents them from ever having to live like us. We have a chance to make a real difference with these new therapies, and I say that not just as a science enthusiast, but as someone who has seen people struggle with anxiety, depression, and PTSD personally and professionally. As someone who never wants to see this suffering again. If the big pharmaceutical manufacturers see something being discovered that they can't monopolize, can't control, and can't profit from, they will fight it down to their last penny. And people like my best friend, the countless others I've met in every other place I have worked, will suffer needlessly for the rest of their lives if we let them win. Sometime in the next 5 years, these new, old, and long overdue treatments will emerge from clinical trials, blinking to the harsh light of political scrutiny, and face the hardest trial of all, the political fight between the ignorant and the informed. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that they will choose short-term profit over public health every single time. Well, not this time. Not with this. There will be a moment for all of us when we will need to stand up, make our voices heard, and fight for the treatments we need to win the war on mental illness, the means of well-being. So, when that day comes, and it will, I hope to see you there. Hey everyone, thank you for watching, and as always, special thank you to my lovely patrons. If you want to see your name in the credits for these videos, the link is down below. This one took me a lot longer than I thought it was going to for life reasons, but my original idea was even longer. You may notice I didn't cover LSD, DMT or ketamine in this video for a variety of reasons, but if you'd like to see me do a video on them someday, let me know in the comments. As always, the algorithm is probably going to hate this one, so if you want to spread the word, drop a like and share the video with your friends. And to all of you watching, I know January can be rough for everyone, so stay safe, stick together, and keep struggling onwards. I'll see you soon.